We now begin part 2, looking at ethical theories. So, also known as moral theories. So, a moral theory, roughly put, would be a theory obviously about ethics and morality, good and evil, and all that stuff. So, with a few more details, when you create a moral theory or someone else create ones, it's supposed to be a systematic development and justification of an account of the nature and foundation of good and evil. These also typically apply moral principles that can be applied in specific situations, depending on the sort of development of the theory. And moral theories, for various reasons, tend to pick like a focus on either actions, like is the action itself inherently good or bad, like we'll see with our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, or they look at the consequences of the actions being what is used to assess morality. We'll see that in the case of John Stuart Mill. Might also look at the motives as to why it's being done. We'll see this in St. Thomas Aquinas, and also, of course, looking primarily at character. And this is the hallmark of virtue theory. And for whatever reason, the big moral theories tend to focus on one. Again, Kant is all about the actions, Mill all about consequences, Aristotle and Confucius all about virtue and character. Moral theories are also supposed to provide a standard or standards for distinguishing between what is actually morally significant, what matters, and what things are not. And moral philosophers vary in terms of what is morally significant. Some take everything to, every action that involves choice to be morally significant because, well, it's involving choice. Thomas Aquinas, for example, takes that view. And if it's a proper moral theory in philosophy, always has to have arguments to back up the parts of the theory. So how do you tell when you've got a good, bad, or ugly moral theory? And here are some quick standards to look at. The first thing is that a moral theory needs to provide ethical standards and guides. And to be a theory in sort of the philosophical tradition, at least certain philosophical traditions, these standards and guides need to be backed up by arguments. There are also many philosophers assume that there must be limits placed on allowed behavior. If there are no limits whatsoever, you might say there's actually, in a sense, no ethics. Although, of course, you could have an ethics which allows everything, no limits. There's also a reasonability requirement that most philosophers impose on theories, that it must solve moral problems in a reasonable way. And, of course, what counts as a solution and what counts as reasonable varies from philosopher to philosopher. There's also, tying back to moral methods looking at appeal to intuitions, there's a general assumption that theories must either correspond to our moral intuitions or, if they go against them, provide adequate grounds for abandoning those likely intuitions. And this gets complicated because people do vary in their intuitions. So a theory to one person might be intuitively appealing, to others not at all. And then, of course, there's some logical stuff, like it's got to be consistent. If there's inconsistencies or contradictions, that means just as a matter of logic, the theory is going to be flawed. It also has to be, in general terms, coherent. And, of course, it needs to be plausible. And again, like with intuitions, what is seen as plausible or implausible varies quite a bit. So one theory might seem plausible to some, but not to others. Now, when doing moral theory stuff, there's also the question of, how do these sort of connect to, real people? If you're not going to be just purely theoretical and ignore what people like to call the real world, what connection is there? Now, some philosophers approach moral theories as an attempt to codify, develop pre-existing moral views held by people. The objective there is begin with what is already held by people outside of, professional philosophy or academic philosophy, and then try to develop those. How well a particular theory captures the views of real people can be a matter of debate. And there's also the debate about whether that should be done. Should we begin by looking at what people already think about ethics and build from there, or not? And as you might imagine, philosophers differ about the approach that should be taken. Now, if we do try to look at real people out in the real world, or as the wild, as I often call it, one thing we'll quickly notice is there's a great deal of moral diversity among people, even people who explicitly identify themselves as part of a explicit moral group. Now, out in the wild, people typically don't say, I'm a utilitarian, I'm a deontologist, etc. But there are groupings, such as religious groups, social groups, etc., which do include sort of explicit moral positions, or at least implied moral positions. And of course, even among those people who, identify themselves as a particular group, their morality can vary quite a bit. So if you're trying to sort of build a moral theory based on what people in the real world think, that can be challenging, even if you focus on like a particular group. For example, just a concrete example, if you take Catholics as an example of a religious view, that's, a church, the Catholic Church. But of course, Catholics as individuals, even as the various officials, disagree about particular ethical positions, as well as the basis of morality. So if you're trying to build like a Catholic morality, that would be challenging because you'd have to kind of decide, okay, which Catholic views on these various issues are the ones that are sort of the definitive morality, and how do you, build upon those? There's also the problem of trying to build from like real world or in the wild moral theories. Most people, until if they get exposed to a philosophy class or read about ethics, etc., they're usually not aware of moral theories like as theories. And so they don't knowingly base their judgments on such theories. So if we're trying to talk about how these moral theories connect to real people out in the wild, they may not at all. They may not use moral theories as such and not be aware of them. It'd be kind of like asking what do people do in terms of quantum theories of quantum physics, etc. Now, there is of course the fact that many moral theories do kind of match up to the real world in some ways. People often think in consequentialist terms. People often think in deontological terms, etc. And so even though people may not be explicitly able to say, aha, holding to like a deontological view or a Kantian view, their view might correspond to a particular moral theory in some manner. So despite the fact that, again, theory doesn't typically like match up with what people out in the wild think, many moral judgments do kind of make sense in terms of existing moral theories. Again, common ones being consequentialists, where people talk about the greatest good for the greatest number, that type of stuff, or deontological views or religious-based ethics. So what are moral theories used for? Like why bother knowing about them? What use are they? Well, one thing they do, of course, in the context, obviously, of philosophy and academics, is they are created to provide an account of ethics, to explain, describe, and systemize, perhaps the existing moral behavior of people. Also to provide, of course, philosophers often say, we're not concerned about existing moral behavior, concerned about providing an original account of ethics, and so trying to present that. Here is what is good and bad, right or wrong. It's similar to how we are motivated to create any theory, to try to typically explain things. So they're academically useful in enhancing our understanding of ethics, at least if they're, a good theory. Some of them may be useless, to be honest. Moral theories, of course, are often created to create ethical systems that serve as a theoretical framework for moral principles, to resolve ethical issues, discuss them in a coherent way, consistent way, etc. And so these theories enable us to have a more focused and systematic approach to ethical issues. And of course, the final thing is they're used to engage in rational moral argumentation. We talked about and earlier content applying moral theories. So they do have their uses even out in the wild. There are, of course, various assumptions about moral theories. And as you'd suspect in philosophy, not all philosophers accept these assumptions. Many of them are questioned, rejected, etc. But these assumptions are common enough that they're worth mentioning when talking about moral theories. So if you accept these assumptions, these can be used as grounds for criticizing theories that don't follow them. But of course, you'd have to back up, why the assumptions are being assumed. Otherwise, it would simply beg the question to say, I assume this theory doesn't do that, so that theory is wrong. One almost universal assumption is that moral theories are prescriptive, kind of in the sense like a prescription like in medicine. So a moral theory is not unlike theories in physics and medicine and so forth. It's not so much trying to say just how things are, but also what you should do. I mean, you could have a moral theory that focuses entirely on just providing an account of ethics with no concern about, telling people what they should do. Except obviously the sort of implied thing that it's generally assumed people should do the good, but that can be debated as well. So typically when you build a moral theory, it's generally assumed that the theory needs to provide guides for what to do, to essentially say to people, this is what this theory prescribes. So using an analogy to medicine, it goes beyond just, saying here's an analysis of, say, an illness, but also tells you how to address that. Now, there are moral theories, of course, that don't make prescriptions. Moral nihilism, as we saw, is a view morality is talking about nothing, so it doesn't make any moral prescriptions because it says that moral prescriptions are talking about nothing. So probably the most common assumption is moral theories need to be prescriptive, with some exceptions. A second common assumption, which can be debated and argued and rejected, is universalizability. The assumption is that moral principles, rules, standards, however you're building your ethical theory, they must apply to all entities, beings, etc., that occupy situations that are relevantly similar. This is based on assumptions of like equality, impartiality, and relevant difference. These, of course, are explicitly argued against and rejected by certain moral theorists. So not all of them accept universalizability. Obvious ones would be relativism, says there are no universal moral principles, except, of course, for relativism, and subjectivism as well. This also, of course, leads to the assumption that moral judgments need to be applied consistently. And we saw this in terms of going back to the moral methods, consistent application. So if this is accepted, if universalizability is accepted, this is grounded on, again, moral equality, obviously impartiality typically, and relevant difference. But of course, there are theories that explicitly reject this. So many accept it, but others, of course, do not. There's also a question in ethics about when you have ethics up against other normative areas, such as law, religion, even aesthetics or etiquette, which one takes precedence? Which one has dominion? This is a kind of analogous to, say, in the United States, between disputes about local law versus state law versus federal law, which takes precedence. Although in the case of ethics versus, say, religion and law, there's no sort of obvious, hierarchy of superiority. So, we typically would think of the law of the entire nation would typically kind of sensibly override, say, more local laws. So, depending on your view of ethics, you would take a position based on that view in terms of which takes precedence. Many ethicists assume, perhaps incorrectly, that ethics should be overriding, that moral principles take precedence over other normative areas. So the concerns about ethics are supposed to override aesthetics, law, etiquette, that's kind of more broadly accepted than, say, religion in terms of ethics versus, say, religion. So it would be kind of unusual for someone to say etiquette, trumps morality. Although there are those, such as legalists and legal positivists, who would say that law does trump morality because law determines morality for them by definition. In the case of aesthetics, theories of art, etc., Oscar Wilde, as an example, he argues essentially that art should not be subject to this moral criticism, but others claim that it should. So this is a matter of considerable debate, especially again when you get into competing ethics versus law and ethics versus religion. And there are moral theories like legalism that says the law overrides ethics, determines ethics. And of course, there is the divine command theory that what God asserts is, God commands is good because he says so, or he forbids is bad because he says not to do that. And so that is also an area of debate. A seemingly odd requirement for ethical theories, is the assumption that moral theories need to be public. Not in the sense like if you're a philosopher, you must post them, in the public space, or, put them out on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or something. But the idea is you can't have secret moral principles. Now, there are some practical reasons for this, similar to in the case of laws. If you want to have laws that are followed, you can't have secret laws because people won't know. So secret moral principles would be somewhat self-defeating. Now, one reason that people sometimes present, or philosophers sometimes present, this public requirement is, we'll see when we talk about ethical egoism. If you're an ethical egoist, the sensible thing to do, of course, is to not tell people you're an ethical egoist. It's kind of like if you're a liar, it would be foolish to tell people you lie. If you're evil, generally it's a foolish idea to tell people you're evil in most circumstances. And so a smart ethical egoist would not tell other people. They would have a secret moral principle, etc. But of course, that would be seen as good on their view. Lastly, there is a matter of practicality. This may seem like an odd thing for philosophy, that something must be practical, but there is an assumption that if a moral principle or theory is impractical, that's to say, an average individual cannot meet at least the conditions of, say, not being evil, that would be an implausible theory, or it'd be defective in some manner. Now, of course, you can have in your moral theory very high standards for being like a good person or extremely good person, but the idea is that a moral theory is not supposed to require the impossible of people. And so if you have a theory that doesn't take into account the limitations of moral agents, like obviously, human beings, it would be defective because of these unrealistic expectations. And this can be seen as analogous to laws that would fail to take into account limitations of people. So, but there are some philosophers who do an interesting thing with this practicality. The main example is our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. He requires that in order you achieve moral perfection, that's like one of his requirements. And you may think, wow, that's impossible. Want to make his theory impossible. And Kant solves that by saying that because morality requires that we achieve perfection, we must have infinite time to do this. And in order to have infinite time, there must be an afterlife in which we're immortal. So Kant infers from this that, hey, we have to, if we want to have morality in which we have to be perfect, then we have to also be immortal. An easier fix would be to say, you don't have to be perfect, but Kant, he seems to really want an afterlife. So that takes us to the end of the general introduction to ethical theory, moral theory, and then next we'll turn to looking at virtue theory, looking at our good dead friends Confucius and Aristotle. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.